The year was 1885, and in the frontier town of Cedar Falls, Montana Territory, a man's worth was measured by his cattle, his land, and his ability to survive another brutal winter. What nobody expected was that a single-dollar bill would change. Two lives forever, challenge an entire community's beliefs, and prove that sometimes the most controversial acts of mercy become the greatest stories of redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana wind cut through Cedar Falls like a blade made of ice and regret. November had arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones and reminded you that winter on the frontier showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The main street of Cedar Falls lay beneath a thin coating of frost, and the wooden sidewalks creaked under the boots of men who walked with their heads down and their collars turned up against the bitter air. Bill Carter stood at the edge of the town square, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 45, he carried himself like a man who had learned that life took more than it gave, but who had made peace with that harsh arithmetic. His face was carved by years of sun and wind, lined with the kind of deep creases that came from squinting across vast pastures and searching horizons for signs of weather or trouble. The brown wool coat he wore was practical rather than fashionable, mended in places where barbed wire and hard work had taken their toll. 3 years had passed since Emma died, and Bill had grown accustomed to the silence that filled the rooms of his ranch house. He told himself he preferred it that way. No one to worry about when the storms came. No one to disappoint when the cattle prices dropped. No one to watch him eat the same beans and bacon night after night, or notice that he sometimes forgot to shave for days at a time. The Broken Creek Ranch ran well enough with just him and his 2 hired hands, Miguel and Joseph, who lived in the bunkhouse and knew better than to ask too many questions about why their boss spent so many evenings sitting alone on his porch, staring at the mountains. Bill had come to town that morning for supplies and to check on a shipment of winter feed that was supposed to arrive on the afternoon train. He hadn't planned to stay for the auction, but something about the crowd gathering in the square had caught his attention. There was an electricity in the air, the kind of tension that came when people sensed they were about to witness something they would talk about for years to come. Men stood in small clusters, their voices low but animated. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their expressions torn between curiosity and disapproval. The auction platform in the center of the square was usually reserved for livestock sales. Bill had been coming to these monthly gatherings for nearly 20 years, watching as cattle, horses, and farming equipment changed hands among the ranchers and farmers who formed the backbone of Cedar Falls' economy. But today was different. Today, the platform would be used for something that made even the hardest men in town shift uncomfortably and avoid direct eye contact with their neighbors. Martha Collins, who ran the general store with her husband Frank, stood near the platform with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her face was set in the kind of disapproving scowl that she usually reserved for customers who tried to negotiate her prices or young people who showed insufficient respect for their elders. "It's a disgrace," she was saying to anyone who would. "Listen, in my day, decent people didn't air their dirty laundry in public like this. There are proper ways to handle these situations." Frank Murphy, the owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon, leaned against a wooden post and spat into the dirt. "Proper or not, Martha, the girl's got debts that need paying. Her daddy left her with nothing but bills and a baby on the way. Law says debts pass to the children. That's just how it is." He adjusted his suspenders and looked around the crowd with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years reading the moods of other men. Besides, 2 years of work ain't the worst thing that could happen to her. Dr. Margaret Hayes stood apart from the other women, her medical bag clutched in one hand and her lips pressed into a thin line of barely contained anger. As the only female doctor within 100 miles, she had seen firsthand what happened to young women who found themselves without protection or resources on the frontier. She had delivered babies in circumstances that would have shocked the proper ladies of Cedar Falls, and she had watched too many women fade away from poverty, exhaustion, and despair. The sight of the auction platform filled her with a cold rage that she struggled to keep hidden behind her professional composure. Sheriff Tom Bradley moved through the crowd with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that his job required him to enforce laws that he didn't always agree with. At 38, he had been keeping the peace in Cedar Falls for nearly a decade, and he had learned that sometimes the law and justice were two very different things. His hand rested unconsciously on the grip of his revolver, not because he expected trouble, but because the weight of it reminded him of his authority and responsibility. The paperwork sitting on his desk back at the jail was clear enough. Lily Thompson owed $347 to various creditors in town, money her father had borrowed to pay for medical care during his final illness. According to territorial law, she could work off the debt through an indenture, contract, or face imprisonment for failure to pay. Pastor Samuel Rivers stood with several members of his congregation, his black suit and white collar marking him as a man of God in a town that paid lip service to religion on Sundays and ignored it the rest of the week. His sermons often focused on the importance of moral behavior and the consequences of sin, and he had made it clear to his flock that young women who found themselves in Lily's condition had only themselves to blame. Yet even he seemed uncomfortable with the spectacle about to unfold. There was something unseemly about conducting such business in broad daylight, in front of the entire community. Judge Henry Walsh climbed the steps to the platform with the measured pace of a man who had presided over countless legal proceedings and had learned to mask his personal feelings behind a facade of judicial impartiality. His black robes flapped in the wind, and his gray beard was neatly trimmed in the fashion of successful men who understood the importance of maintaining appearances. The leather-bound ledger in his hands contained the legal documentation that would make the day's proceedings official and binding. Bill found himself moving closer to the platform, despite his intention to simply observe and then return to his ranch. Something about the situation bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was the memory of Emma, who had always been quick to defend anyone she perceived as vulnerable or unfairly treated. Maybe it was the uncomfortable realization that he had been so focused on his own grief and isolation that he had stopped paying attention to the suffering of others. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that what was about to happen would cross a line that the community might never be able to uncross. The crowd fell silent as a door opened at the side of the courthouse and two figures emerged. The first was Deputy Marshal James Crawford, a thin man with nervous eyes who clearly wished he was anywhere else. The second was Lily Thompson, and the sight of her caused Bill's breath to catch in his throat. She was younger than he had expected, probably no more than 19, with dark hair that had been pinned back in a simple style and a face that carried the kind of quiet dignity that couldn't be broken by circumstances or shame. Her dress was clean but worn, the fabric faded from multiple washings, and it did little to conceal her pregnancy. She walked with her head held high, her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd. Bill had seen that look before, in the eyes of cattle caught in a blizzard. It was the expression of a living creature that understood it was facing something terrible, but refused to panic or give up hope. There was strength in her posture, a determination that suggested she had made peace with whatever was about to happen and would face it on her own terms. She moved with the careful grace of a woman who was aware that every eye in the square was watching her, judging her, measuring her worth against their own moral standards. Robert Mitchell pushed through the crowd with the confidence of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. At 52, he owned the largest ranch in the territory and had built his wealth through a combination of shrewd business sense, political connections, and a willingness to exploit any advantage he could find. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as a man of substance, and the way other men stepped aside to let him pass confirmed his status in the community hierarchy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His pale blue eyes fixed on Lily with an intensity that made several women in the crowd look away in disgust. Mitchell had made his intentions clear in the days leading up to the auction. He needed workers for his ranch, and he wasn't particular about where they came from or what their circumstances might be. The fact that Lily was young, pregnant, and completely without protection made her an ideal candidate for the kind of arrangement he had in mind. 2 years of unpaid labor would more than cover her debts, and if she proved to be useful and compliant, he might be willing to extend the contract indefinitely. Judge Walsh raised his hand to quiet the murmuring crowd and began to read from the legal documents in his ledger. His voice carried across the square with the authority of law and custom, but Bill found himself focusing more on Lily's face than on the judge's words. She stood perfectly still, her eyes now closed, and he could see her lips moving silently. Whether she was praying or simply trying to gather her strength, he couldn't tell, but something about her quiet courage touched a part of his heart that he had thought was permanently sealed off. The bidding began at $50, and Mitchell immediately raised it to $100. Other voices called out higher amounts, but it quickly became clear that this was a contest between Mitchell and 2 other ranchers who saw an opportunity to acquire cheap labor. Bill listened to the rising bids with growing discomfort, disturbed by the casual way these men discussed the purchase of another human being. The fact that it was legal didn't make it right, and the fact that it was necessary didn't make it acceptable. Agnes Porter, the schoolteacher, stood near the front of the crowd with tears streaming down her face. She had taught Lily to read and write in the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, and she had watched the girl's dreams of becoming a teacher herself crumble when her father became ill and the family's modest savings disappeared into medical bills and funeral expenses. Agnes had tried to help, offering what little money she could spare from her teacher's salary, but it had been like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. The bidding reached $200, then $250, with Mitchell still leading. He bid with the casual confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, and his smile grew wider with each competing offer. Bill could see the predatory gleam in his eyes, the satisfaction of a hunter who knew his prey was trapped. The other bidders began to drop out as the price climbed, unwilling or unable to match Mitchell's resources. At $275, Mitchell appeared to have won. Judge Walsh called for any final bids, his gavel raised and ready to make the sale official. That was when Bill stepped forward, his voice cutting through the cold air with surprising strength. $1. The crowd turned to stare at him in confusion. Mitchell's smile faltered, and Judge Walsh lowered his gavel with a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, but the bidding is currently at $275. Did you mean to bid $276? Bill shook his head, his eyes never leaving Lily's face. She had opened her eyes at the sound of his voice and was looking at him with an expression of bewilderment and something that might have been hope. "No, Your Honor, I bid $1. According to territorial law, any bid of $1 or more constitutes a valid offer for an indenture contract, regardless of the amount of debt involved. The law states that the purpose is to provide labor and care for the debtor, not to enrich the creditors." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Mitchell's face darkened with anger, and he stepped closer to the platform. "That's ridiculous. The girl's debts are worth far more than $1. I bid $300. Judge Walsh consulted his legal books, his weathered fingers moving quickly through the pages. After several minutes of searching, He looked up with an expression of grudging admiration. Mr. Carter is correct. According to Territorial Code Section 47, subsection 12, any bid of $1 or more constitutes a legally binding offer for an indenture contract. The amount of the bid does not have to correspond to the amount of the debt. The purpose of the law is to ensure that debtors have the opportunity to work off their obligations under reasonable conditions, not to create a profit center for creditors. Mitchell's face turned red with fury. This is outrageous. I've been planning this purchase for weeks. You can't let some broken-down rancher steal my property with a technicality. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. Easy there, Bob. Nobody's stealing anything. The law is the law, and Mr. Carter seems to know it better than the rest of us. Bill reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, holding it up for everyone to see. I'm prepared to pay immediately, Your Honor. Cash on the barrelhead. Judge Walsh looked around the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events, but unable to find any legal grounds for rejecting Bill's bid. Are there any other offers of $1 or more? Mitchell opened his mouth to speak, then apparently realized that bidding against a $1 offer would only drive the price down to his disadvantage. He glared at Bill with undisguised hatred, then pushed his way back through the crowd, muttering threats and curses under his breath. Going once, going twice. Judge Walsh paused, giving the crowd one final chance to intervene. When no one spoke, he brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed across the square. Sold to William Carter for $1. The crowd erupted in a mixture of applause, angry shouts, and confused murmuring. Some people seemed impressed by Bill's legal maneuvering, while others were outraged by what they saw as a mockery of the proceedings. Dr. Hayes smiled for the first time all day, while Pastor Rivers shook his head in disapproval. Agnes Porter wiped her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Bill walked to the platform and handed his dollar to Judge Walsh, who made the appropriate notations in his ledger and prepared the indenture papers. The contract is for 2 years, Mr. Carter, during which time Miss Thompson will work to pay off her debts. You're responsible for providing food, shelter, and medical care as needed. She's not to be mistreated or abused in any way, and she has the right to appeal to this court if she feels her treatment is unfair. I understand, Your Honor. Judge Walsh handed him the papers, then looked at Lily with something that might have been sympathy. Miss Thompson, you're now legally bound to work for Mr. Carter for a period of 2 years, or until your debts are satisfied, whichever comes first. Do you understand your obligations? Lily nodded, her voice barely audible. Above the wind. Yes, sir. Bill folded the papers carefully and tucked them into his coat pocket. Then he turned to Lily and removed his hat, a gesture of respect that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Miss Thompson, I'm Bill Carter. I have a ranch about 8 miles outside of town. If you're ready, we can head out there now. She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for some clue about what kind of man he might be. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because she nodded and stepped down from the platform. I'm ready, Mr. Carter. The crowd began to disperse, people returning to their daily routines, but carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Some would tell the story as an example of Christian charity, while others would paint it as the eccentric behavior of a lonely man who had clearly lost his grip on reality. But all of them would remember the moment when Bill Carter paid $1 for something that couldn't truly be bought or sold, and changed the course of 2 lives forever. The wagon ride to Broken Creek Ranch passed in near silence, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of wheels against frozen ground and the occasional snort from Bill's Duchess. Lily sat beside him on the wooden bench, her hands folded carefully over her rounded belly, her eyes taking in the vast expanse of Montana territory that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The landscape was both beautiful and intimidating. rolling hills covered in brown grass that bent and swayed in the bitter wind, punctuated by stands of bare cottonwood trees and distant mountain peaks that gleamed white with early snow. Bill stole glances at his unexpected passenger, still struggling to understand what had prompted him to intervene at the auction. He wasn't a man given to impulsive gestures, and Emma had often teased him about his tendency to think every decision through twice before acting. Yet something about seeing Lily standing on that platform, facing the prospect of being sold to Robert Mitchell, had awakened a protective instinct he thought had died with his wife. Perhaps it was the way she had held herself with such dignity, despite her circumstances, or the quiet resignation in her eyes that reminded him of wounded animals he had found on his property over the years. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but cautious, like two people trying to take each other's measure without appearing to do so. Lily had spoken little since leaving town, offering only polite responses to his few attempts at conversation. He couldn't blame her for being wary. From her perspective, she had simply traded one unknown situation for another, and she had no way of knowing whether his intentions were any more honorable than Mitchell's had been. As they crested a low hill, the ranch buildings came into view. In the valley below, the main house was a sturdy two-story structure built from local timber and stone, its covered porch facing east to catch the morning sun. A red barn stood nearby, flanked by several smaller outbuildings and a network of corrals that currently held about 30 head of cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney of the bunkhouse, where Miguel and Joseph would be preparing their evening meal, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows of the main house. "It's beautiful," Lily said softly, the first words she had spoken without being asked a direct question. "Your wife must have loved it here." Bill felt his throat tighten at the unexpected mention of Emma. Most people in Cedar Falls avoided talking about her, as if acknowledging her death might somehow remind him of his loss. "She did," he said quietly. "She used to sit on that porch every morning with her coffee, watching the sun come up over the mountains. Said it was like watching God paint a new picture every day." Lily smiled for the first time since he had met her, a gentle expression that transformed her face completely. "She sounds like she was a wise woman. Wiser than me, that's for certain." Bill guided the wagon down the slope toward the house, wondering what Emma would have thought of his impulsive decision to bid on Lily's contract. She probably would have approved, he realized. Emma had never been able to turn away from anyone in need, whether it was a sick animal or a neighbor facing hard times. Miguel Santana emerged from the barn as they approached, his weathered face creasing with curiosity as he took in their unexpected guest. At 62, Miguel had been working on the ranch for nearly 15 years, and his loyalty to Bill was absolute. He had been there during Emma's illness, helping with chores she could no longer manage and sitting with her when Bill needed to tend to the cattle. His English was accented but clear, and his steady presence had been one of the few constants in Bill's life since his wife's death. "Boss," Miguel said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "We weren't expecting company." "This is Miss Thompson," Bill said, climbing down from the wagon and moving around to help Lily descend. "She'll be staying with us for a while. Miguel, would you mind taking care of Duchess? Miss Thompson and I need to discuss the arrangements." Miguel nodded, his dark eyes taking in Lily's condition without judgment. He had raised 8 children of his own with his late wife Maria, and he understood the challenges facing young women in difficult circumstances. "Of course, boss. I'll put some extra wood by the kitchen door. Looks like the temperature's going to drop tonight." Bill led Lily up the front steps and into the house, suddenly aware of how the place might look to a visitor's eyes. The furniture was sturdy but worn, chosen for practicality rather than style. Dust motes danced in the fading sunlight that streamed through windows that could have used a woman's touch for cleaning. The kitchen showed signs of a man cooking for himself, with dishes stacked haphazardly, and none of the small decorative touches that Emma had favored. "I know it's not much," Bill said, feeling oddly embarrassed by the house's bachelor appearance. Emma had a way of making everything look warmer and more welcoming. I'm afraid I've let things slide a bit since she passed. Lily looked around the room with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to make the best of whatever shelter was available. It's clean and warm and solid, she said. That's more than many people have, especially this time of year. Bill gestured toward the stairs leading to the second floor. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs. Mine is at the front of the house, and Emma used the one next to it for her sewing room. The third one has been empty since she died, but it has a good bed and a window facing south. You'd have privacy and plenty of light during the day. Lily followed him upstairs, her hand trailing along the wooden banister that Emma had polished smooth with years of daily care. The bedroom Bill showed her was simply furnished but comfortable, with a 4-poster bed covered by a colorful quilt, a small dresser with an attached mirror, and a wooden chair positioned near the window. The walls were painted a soft yellow that would catch and hold whatever sunlight managed to penetrate the Montana gloom. "This is lovely," Lily said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and testing its firmness. "Much nicer than anything I've had since my father became ill." Bill found himself studying her face, noting the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes and the way she unconsciously placed a protective hand over her belly. "Miss Thompson, I want you to understand something. What happened today at the auction, the legal arrangement we have, that's just paperwork. You're not my property, and I don't intend to treat you like a servant. You're a guest in this house, and you'll be treated with respect as long as you're here." Lily looked up at him with an expression of cautious hope. "That's very kind of you to say, Mr. Carter, but I understand my situation. I have debts to work off, and you have the right to expect service in return for taking on my obligations. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't expect charity." "It's not charity," Bill said firmly. "It's the right thing to do. Emma always said that how we treat people when they can't do anything for us is the true measure of our character." He moved toward the door, then paused. "There's something else you should know. The baby you're carrying, that doesn't change anything as far as I'm concerned. When the time comes, we'll make sure you have proper medical care. Dr. Hayes is a good woman and a skilled physician." Tears gathered in Lily's eyes, though she tried to blink them away. "You don't know anything about me, Mr. Carter. You don't know how I came to be in this situation or what kind of person I might be. Why would you take such a risk for a stranger?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, remembering Emma's final words to him about not letting grief turn him into a man who stopped caring about others. "Because everybody deserves a chance to start over," he said finally, "and because I think my wife would have liked you." That night, Lily lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. The wind whistled through the eaves of the house, and somewhere in the distance she could hear cattle lowing softly in their shelter. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching safety, though she was careful not to let herself hope for too much. Experience had taught her that kindness often came with unexpected prices, and she had learned to be wary of men who seemed too good to be true. The baby moved restlessly inside her, and she placed both hands on her belly, whispering soft words of reassurance. She had been barely 18 when Thomas Whitman had swept her off her feet with his charming smile and grand promises of marriage. He had been the son of a successful merchant family from back east, visiting Cedar Falls on business, and she had been flattered by his attention and convinced that he represented her ticket to a better life. By the time she realized that his promises were empty and that he had no intention of taking responsibility for the consequences of their relationship, he had already returned to his comfortable life in Boston, leaving her to face the judgment of a small town that had no tolerance for unwed mothers. Her father, John Thompson, had done his best to support her through the scandal, but his health was already failing, and the medical bills were mounting faster than his modest income as a blacksmith could cover. when he died 3 months ago. Lily had discovered that their debts were far more extensive than she had realized. Creditors had come forward with claims for money borrowed to pay for medicines, doctor visits, and even her father's funeral expenses. The law was clear on the matter of inherited debt, and she had been given the choice between indentured servitude or imprisonment. Now she found herself in the home of a man she barely knew, bound by a legal contract that could be interpreted in any number of ways depending on his character and intentions. Bill Carter seemed decent enough, but she had been fooled by appearances before. She would need to be careful, to watch for signs of his true nature while fulfilling her obligations under their agreement. The next morning brought a covering of fresh snow and temperatures that made the windows frost over in elaborate patterns. Lily woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen, and she dressed quickly in one of the 2 dresses she owned that still fit over her expanding belly. When she came downstairs, she found Bill standing at the stove, turning strips of bacon with practiced efficiency. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "I hope the bed was comfortable. The house gets a bit drafty when the wind picks up like it did last night. I slept very well, thank you." Lily moved to the kitchen window and looked out at the transformed landscape, where familiar shapes had been softened and disguised by the white blanket of snow. "It's beautiful, but it looks like winter is arriving early this year." "That's Montana for you," Bill said, transferring the bacon to a plate and cracking eggs into the hot grease. "Weather doesn't pay much attention to what the calendar says. Miguel was right about the temperature dropping. We'll need to move the cattle to the winter pasture sooner than I planned." Lily watched him work, noting the easy competence with which he handled the cooking duties. "May I help with breakfast? I'm a decent cook, and I'd like to earn my keep." Bill glanced at her over his shoulder, taking in her determined expression. "I told you last night that you're a guest here, not a servant. But if you want to help, I won't say no." Emma always said cooking was more enjoyable when there was someone to talk to. They worked together in comfortable efficiency, Lily slicing bread and preparing coffee while Bill finished the eggs and set the table. The domestic rhythm felt natural and peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension and uncertainty that had dominated her life for the past several months. When they sat down to eat, Bill asked polite questions about her background and interests, treating her like a dinner guest rather than an indentured worker. "My father taught me to read and write," Lily said in response to his question about her education. He believed that knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be taken away from a person, no matter what other misfortunes might befall them. "I attended Miss Porter's school until I turned 16, and I had hoped to become a teacher myself someday." "What changed your mind?" Bill asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lily's cheeks colored slightly, but she met his gaze steadily. "Life changed my mind, Mr. Carter. Sometimes circumstances force us to abandon our dreams in favor of more immediate concerns." "Dreams have a way of coming back," Bill said quietly. "Maybe not in the form we originally imagined, but they have a way of finding us again when we're ready for them." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door, followed by the sound of boots stamping on the porch to shake off snow. Bill frowned, wondering who would be visiting so early in the morning, especially in weather like this. When he opened the door, he found Sheriff Bradley standing on his porch, his face grim beneath the brim of his snow-covered hat. "Morning, Bill," the sheriff said, glancing past him toward the kitchen where Lily sat at the table. "I hate to bother you, but I need to have a word with you about yesterday's events." Bill stepped back to allow the sheriff inside, noting the tension in the other man's posture. "Coffee's still hot if you'd like some, Tom. What's on your mind?" Sheriff Bradley removed his hat and coat, hanging them on the pegs by the door. "I've been getting complaints, Bill. Folks in town are saying you made a mockery of the legal system yesterday with that $1 bid. Some are suggesting that the whole thing was arranged in advance, that you and the girl conspired to cheat the legitimate bidders out of their rights." "That's ridiculous," Bill said, his voice sharpening with anger. "I never met Miss Thompson before yesterday, and my decision to bid was completely spontaneous. If people want to complain about the law, they should take it up with the territorial legislature, not with me for knowing how to read the statutes. I know that, and you know that, but perception has a way of becoming reality in a town like Cedar Falls." The sheriff accepted a cup of coffee from Lily, who had risen to serve. Their unexpected guest. "Thank you, miss. I hope you're settling in well." "Yes, sir. Mr. Carter has been very kind." Sheriff Bradley studied her face, looking for signs of distress or coercion. "You understand that you have rights under the indenture contract. If you're mistreated in any way, you can appeal to the court for protection." "I understand, Sheriff Bradley, but I don't anticipate any problems." The sheriff nodded, satisfied for the moment with her response. "Bill, I need you to understand that Robert Mitchell is furious about what happened yesterday. He's been telling anyone who will listen that you stole what was rightfully his, and he's threatening to find legal grounds to challenge the contract." "Let him try," Bill said grimly. "The law is on my side, and he knows it. If Mitchell wants to waste his money on lawyers, that's his business." "It's not just Mitchell you need to worry about," the sheriff continued. "There are others in town who are uncomfortable with the whole situation. Pastor Rivers has been preaching about the moral implications of your arrangement, and some of the women are saying it's not proper for an unmarried, pregnant woman to be living alone with a bachelor." Bill felt his temper rising at the hypocrisy of people who had been perfectly willing to watch Lily be sold to the highest bidder but now questioned his motives for providing her with decent shelter. "What exactly are you suggesting, Tom? That I should have left her to Mitchell's tender mercies? That would have been more moral?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Bill. I'm just warning you that there's talk, and talk has a way of turning into action if it goes on long enough. You might want to consider having Dr. Hayes come out here periodically to check on Miss Thompson's welfare. It would help silence some of the speculation about your intentions." After the sheriff left, Bill and Lily finished their breakfast in thoughtful silence. The visit had reminded them both that their arrangement existed within a larger community that would be watching their every move and looking for evidence to support whatever conclusions they had already reached. The fragile peace of the morning had been shattered by the reminder that the outside world would not be content to leave them alone. "I'm sorry," Lily said finally. "I never meant to bring trouble into your life, Mr. Carter. If my presence here is going to cause problems for you, perhaps we should reconsider the arrangement." Bill looked across the table at her, taking in the worry lines that had reappeared around her eyes and the way she had unconsciously wrapped her arms around herself in a protective gesture. "Miss Thompson, let me make something clear. I don't give a damn what the gossips in Cedar Falls think about my personal business. You're staying here because it's the right thing to do, and if that makes some people uncomfortable, they'll just have to learn to live with their discomfort." Throughout the rest of that first week, Bill began to understand just how much his life had changed with Lily's arrival. The house felt different with another person in it, less like a museum dedicated to Emma's memory and more like a home where life continued to unfold. Lily had a quiet way of making small improvements without calling attention to what she was doing. Flowers appeared in vases that had sat empty for years. Meals became more elaborate and flavorful. The sitting room was rearranged to take better advantage of the natural light. She also proved to be genuinely helpful with the ranch work, despite her pregnancy. She could handle bookkeeping tasks that Bill had been neglecting, and she had a natural way with the animals that impressed both Miguel and Joseph. When one of the milk cows developed an infection in her udder, Lily demonstrated a knowledge of herbal remedies that probably saved the animal's life. "Where did you learn about healing?" Bill asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Lily working on mending a shirt while he reviewed the ranch's financial records. "My mother," Lily replied without looking up from her sewing. "She died when I was 12, but before that she was known throughout the county for her skill with medicinal plants. People would travel for miles to get her help with difficult births or stubborn illnesses. She taught me everything she could before she passed. That's a valuable skill to have, Bill said. Dr. Hayes would probably appreciate having someone to discuss cases with. She gets lonely being the only medical professional for miles around. As the days passed, Bill found himself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire. Lily was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on everything from politics to literature that she expressed with quiet conviction. She had a dry sense of humor that reminded him of Emma, though her experiences had given her a more realistic view of human nature than his wife had possessed. But even as their domestic routine established itself, the outside pressure continued to build. Martha Collins made pointed comments whenever Bill came to town for supplies, wondering aloud how long his charitable arrangement would continue. Pastor Rivers delivered sermons about the importance of moral propriety that everyone understood were directed at Bill's household. Robert Mitchell glared at him with undisguised hatred whenever their paths crossed, and Bill began to notice that some of his longtime acquaintances seemed uncomfortable engaging him in their usual friendly conversations. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon when Bill and Lily were in town together, shopping for winter supplies. They had been careful to maintain proper appearances, with Lily staying close to the wagon while Bill conducted his business. But their very presence together seemed to inflame the gossips. A group of women gathered outside the general store, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. "It's a scandal, plain and simple," Martha Collins was saying to her assembled audience. "That poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into, mark my words. Men like Bill Carter don't take in pregnant women out of the goodness of their hearts." "She's probably grateful for any roof over her head," added Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, the banker's wife. "But gratitude can be a dangerous thing when a woman is in a vulnerable position. She might feel obligated to provide services that go far beyond the terms of any legal contract." Agnes Porter, who had been listening to the conversation with growing indignation, finally spoke up. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves. Bill Carter is a decent man who saw someone in need and offered help. If more people in this town had his courage and compassion, maybe Lily wouldn't have found herself in such desperate circumstances in the first place." "Easy for you to say, Agnes," Martha replied sharply. "You don't have to worry about the example this sets for impressionable young women. What message does it send when we allow unmarried couples to cohabitate without consequence?" "The message it sends," Agnes shot back, "is that human decency still exists in this world, even when it's in short supply." Bill heard enough of the exchange to understand its general thrust, and he could see the impact the words were having on Lily. Her face had gone pale, and she seemed to shrink in on herself as if trying to become invisible. When they finished their shopping and climbed back into the wagon, she was silent for the entire ride home. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Lily finally voiced what had been troubling her all day. "Mr. Carter, I think perhaps it would be best if I moved to the barn loft or the bunkhouse. The arrangement we have now is causing too much talk, and I don't want your reputation to suffer because of me." Bill looked up from the book he had been reading, Emma's worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. "My reputation can take care of itself, Miss Thompson, and you're not moving to any barn loft. The very idea is ridiculous." "But people are talking," Lily insisted. "They're saying terrible things about both of us, and it's only going to get worse as time goes on. Maybe if we were more careful about appearances." "Let them talk," Bill said firmly. "Small-minded people will always find something to gossip about. If it wasn't this, it would be something else. The only opinions that matter are our own and God's, and I sleep fine at night knowing that we're both doing right by each other." Lily studied his face, searching for any sign that he was simply being polite, or that the social pressure was affecting him more than he was willing to admit. You really don't care what they say about you? I care about doing what's right, Bill replied. Everything else is just noise. But even as he spoke the words, Bill knew that the situation was becoming more complicated. The community's disapproval was creating an atmosphere of tension that affected every aspect of their lives. He could see it in the way some of his longtime customers were beginning to take their business elsewhere, in the cool reception he received at church, in the careful distance that even friendly neighbors now maintained when they encountered him in town. More troubling still was the way the criticism seemed to be affecting Lily. She had grown quieter and more withdrawn over the past few days, and he could see the old wariness returning to her eyes. The progress they had made in building a comfortable relationship was being eroded by the constant pressure of outside judgment, and he wasn't sure how to protect her from forces that seemed determined to make their situation untenable. As winter tightened its grip on the Montana territory and the social pressure continued to mount, Bill found himself facing a challenge that was more complex than anything he had dealt with since Emma's death. He had thought that providing Lily with shelter and respect would be enough, but he was beginning to realize that sometimes doing the right thing required more courage and determination than he had anticipated. The real test of their arrangement was just beginning, and the outcome would depend on whether their growing trust in each other could withstand the sustained assault of a community determined to see them fail. The first real test of Bill's resolve came on a bitter December morning when he discovered fresh horse tracks circling his property. Miguel had noticed them first, the deep impressions in the snow indicating riders who had come close enough to observe the house but had stayed just beyond the tree line where they couldn't be easily seen. The tracks suggested at least 3 horses, and they followed a pattern that spoke of deliberate surveillance rather than casual passage. "Boss," Miguel said quietly as they stood examining the evidence near the eastern fence line. "These riders, they were here for a long time. Maybe 2-3 hours. They were watching the house." Bill knelt beside the clearest set of prints, noting the distinctive notch in one horse's left rear shoe. He had seen that mark before in the dirt outside Mitchell's ranch, and the recognition sent a cold anger through his chest. "How long ago would you say?" "Last night, maybe early this morning before the new snow started." Miguel's weathered face was grim with concern. "They came back 3 times this week, boss. Different nights, but always the same pattern, always watching." The implications were clear enough. Someone was keeping track of the comings and goings. At Broken Creek Ranch, documenting who visited and when, looking for evidence of impropriety or violation of the indenture contract terms. Bill suspected that Mitchell was behind the surveillance, hoping to find grounds for challenging the legal arrangement, but he couldn't prove it without confronting the man directly. When he returned to the house, Bill found Lily in the kitchen preparing lunch, her movements efficient despite the increasing awkwardness of her pregnancy. She was now well into her 7th month, and Dr. Hayes had been making regular visits to monitor her health and the baby's development. The doctor's presence had helped quiet some of the more vicious rumors, but it hadn't stopped the watchers or the whispered speculation about what really went on at the isolated ranch. "We had visitors last night," Bill said carefully, not wanting to alarm her but needing her to be aware of the situation. "Someone's been keeping an eye on the place. I want you to stay close to the house for the next few days, and if you see anyone you don't recognize, come find me immediately." Lily set down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the soup and turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the mixture of fear and resignation. "It's Mr. Mitchell, isn't it? He's trying to find evidence that you're violating the contract." "Terms? I don't know for certain," Bill replied, though they both knew the truth. "But I want you to be careful. These men, whoever they are, they're not just curious neighbors." The knowledge that they were being watched changed the atmosphere at the ranch in subtle but significant ways. Lily became more cautious about her movements around the property, staying closer to the main buildings and avoiding the open areas where she might be easily observed from a distance. Bill found himself checking the horizon more frequently as he went about his daily work, looking for signs of riders or the glint of sunlight off spyglass lenses. Miguel and Joseph, the two ranch hands, took to carrying their rifles more openly and making extra rounds of the property boundaries. Both men had worked for Bill long enough to develop genuine loyalty, and they had come to regard Lily as part of the ranch family. Joseph, in particular, had grown protective of her after she helped his wife recover from a difficult bout of pneumonia using her knowledge of herbal remedies. The tension came to a head on a snowy Thursday afternoon when Bill was working in the barn, repairing tack in preparation for the spring roundup. He heard voices outside, raised in anger, and emerged to find 3 men on horseback confronting Lily near the well. She stood with her back straight and her chin raised, but he could see the fear in her posture and the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The leader of the group was Jake Morrison, one of Mitchell's foremen, a hard man known for his quick temper and questionable methods. The other 2 were ranch hands Bill didn't recognize, probably hired guns brought in specifically for this kind of intimidation work. Morrison sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his employer's wealth gave him the right to act without consequences. "Like I was saying, Missy," Morrison was drawling in a tone that made Bill's blood boil, "Mr. Mitchell's got a legal interest in this situation. He was the high bidder at that auction, and he's got reason to believe there might have been some irregularities in the proceedings. He's within his rights to inspect the premises and make sure you're being treated according to the terms of your contract." "I'm being treated very well, thank you," Lily replied, her voice steady despite the obvious stress of the confrontation. "And I don't believe you have any legal authority to be on this property without Mr. Carter's permission." One of the other riders, a thin man with pale eyes and a scraggly beard, laughed unpleasantly. "Legal authority? That's rich, coming from a whore who got herself knocked up and had to be sold like a brood murray to pay her daddy's debts." The insult hit Lily like a physical blow, and Bill saw her flinch as if she had been struck. That was when something cold and dangerous awakened in his chest, a protective fury that reminded him of the way he had felt when predators threatened his livestock. He stepped out of the barn shadows, his hands loose at his sides but ready for whatever might come. "Gentlemen," he said in a voice that carried across the yard like the crack of a whip, "you're on my property without permission, and you're insulting a lady under my protection. I suggest you leave now, before this situation gets out of hand." Morrison turned in his saddle to face Bill, his expression shifting from casual mockery to something more calculating. "Well, well, the knight in shining armor arrives to defend his investment. Tell me, Carter, what exactly is the nature of your arrangement with this young lady? The contract says she's supposed to be working off her debts, but folks are wondering just what kind of work she's doing for you." Bill walked toward the mounted men with deliberate slowness, each step measured and purposeful. Miguel appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, his rifle held casually but ready, while Joseph emerged from behind the barn with his shotgun cradled in his arms. The 3 riders suddenly found themselves outnumbered and in an increasingly disadvantageous position. "The nature of my arrangement with Miss Thompson is none of your business," Bill said quietly. "But since you seem confused about the law, let me clarify things for you. According to the territorial statutes governing indenture contracts, I have the sole authority to determine the working conditions and living arrangements for anyone bound by such an agreement. No one else has the right to inspect, question, or interfere with those arrangements unless there's evidence of actual abuse or violation of the contract terms." Morrison's confidence faltered slightly as he realized that Bill was better informed about the legal situation than he had expected. "Mitchell's got lawyers, Carter. Real lawyers who know how to read between the lines of fancy legal talk. Then maybe Mitchell should have his lawyers explain to him what constitutes trespassing and harassment under territorial law," Bill replied. Because right now, you and your friends are in violation of both, and I have witnesses to prove it. The bearded rider's hand moved toward his gun, but the sound of Miguel working the lever on his rifle made him freeze. The Mexican had positioned himself with a clear field of fire, and his reputation as a marksman was well known throughout the territory. Joseph had also shifted position to cover the flanks, and the three intruders suddenly realized that they were in a potentially lethal situation. "This isn't over, Carter," Morrison said, wheeling his horse around with more haste than dignity. "Mitchell's not going to forget this, and neither are the decent folks in Cedar Falls who know what you're really up to out here. Give Mitchell my regards," Bill said calmly, "and tell him that the next time he wants to discuss my business, he can come see me himself instead of sending hired thugs to terrorize a pregnant woman." The three riders spurred their horses toward the road, but not before the bearded man spat in the snow near Lily's feet, a gesture of contempt that made Bill's hands clench into fists. He forced himself to remain calm until they were out of sight, then turned to check on Lily, who was still standing by the well with her arms wrapped around herself. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, noting the pallor of her face and the way her breathing had become rapid and shallow. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her voice was shaky and her hands were trembling more noticeably now. "They didn't hurt me. They just wanted to scare me, I think." Bill looked at Miguel and Joseph, who were still watching the road for signs that the riders might return. "Double the night watches," he told them quietly. "And if anyone comes onto this property again without permission, you have my authority to use whatever force is necessary to remove them." Both men nodded grimly. They had worked for Bill long enough to understand that he wasn't a man given to empty threats, and the protective edge in his voice told them that the situation had moved beyond mere legal harassment into something more personal and dangerous. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Lily was quieter than usual, her sewing lying forgotten in her lap as she stared into the flames. Bill could see that the afternoon's confrontation had shaken her more than she was willing to admit, and he struggled to find the right words to reassure her without minimizing the very real danger they were facing. "I won't let them hurt you," he said finally, the simple declaration carrying more weight than any elaborate promise might have. "Whatever Mitchell is planning, whatever games he wants to play, I won't let him use you as a pawn." Lily looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper that might have been gratitude or trust. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you willing to risk so much for someone you barely know? You could send me away, tell people that the arrangement isn't working out. Mitchell would probably be satisfied with that, and the gossip would die down eventually." Bill was quiet for a long moment, trying to understand his own motivations. The easy answer was that it was the right thing to do, but he knew there was more to it than simple moral obligation. Somewhere in the week since the auction, Lily had become more than just a responsibility or a good deed. She had become part of his life in a way that he hadn't expected and couldn't easily explain. "When Emma was dying," he said slowly, "she made me promise that I wouldn't let grief turn me into a bitter old man who stopped caring about other people. She said that the worst thing that could happen to me wouldn't be losing her, but losing the part of myself that she had fallen in love with in the first place." He paused, remembering those final conversations with his wife, the way she had worried more about his future than her own fading health. "I think she would have liked you," he continued. "She would have admired your strength and your dignity, and she would have been furious with anyone who tried to treat you as less than you are." Lily felt tears gather in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Bill agreed. "And she taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is stand between the strong and the weak, between the cruel and the vulnerable. That's not heroism, it's just basic human decency." The next few weeks brought an escalation. In the pressure from outside forces, but also a strengthening of the bonds within the small community at Broken Creek Ranch. Dr. Hayes became a regular visitor, not just for medical reasons, but as a source of support and female companionship for Lily. The doctor had grown up in Boston and brought with her a more cosmopolitan view of social relationships that helped counter some of the narrow-minded judgment. Coming from Cedar Falls, Agnes Porter also began making weekly visits, bringing books and supplies for Lily's continuing education. The schoolteacher had decided that if the community was going to ostracize her for defending Bill and Lily, she might as well earn that ostracism by providing actual assistance. Her presence served as a reminder that not everyone in Cedar Falls subscribed to the mob mentality that was driving much of the criticism. But for every ally they gained, it seemed that two new enemies emerged. Pastor Rivers delivered increasingly pointed sermons about moral corruption and the dangers of tolerating sin within the community. Robert Mitchell made sure that stories about the irregular situation at the Carter Ranch spread beyond Cedar Falls to neighboring towns and settlements. Anonymous letters appeared in the territorial newspaper, calling for official investigation of what the writers termed a mockery of Christian values and legal propriety. The economic pressure was perhaps the most immediate concern. Several of Bill's longtime customers began taking their business elsewhere, claiming that they couldn't in good conscience deal with a man who flouted community standards so brazenly. The bank, where Mitchell held considerable influence, began making noises about calling in some of Bill's outstanding loans earlier than originally agreed. It became clear that the campaign against him was being coordinated and financed by people with significant resources and political connections. Through it all, Bill maintained his stubborn refusal to compromise or explain himself to his critics. He went about his business with the same quiet determination that had seen him through Emma's illness and death, though those closest to him could see the strain in the set of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. Miguel and Joseph watched him with growing concern, recognizing the signs of a man being pushed toward his breaking point. The crisis that everyone had been dreading finally arrived on a cold February morning when Sheriff Bradley rode up to the ranch with papers in his hand and an expression of reluctant duty on his face. Bill met him on the porch, already knowing from the sheriff's posture that the news would not be good. "I'm sorry about this, Bill," the sheriff said without preamble. "Judge Walsh has issued a court order requiring Miss Thompson to appear for a hearing regarding the terms of her indenture contract. There have been formal complaints filed alleging that the contract is being violated and that she's being subjected to conditions not specified in the original agreement." Bill took the papers and scanned them quickly, his lawyer's training from his younger days helping him understand the legal language. The complaints were vague but serious, alleging everything from improper living arrangements to potential physical abuse. More troubling still was the revelation that Mitchell had hired a territorial prosecutor to represent his interests in the matter. "When is the hearing?" Bill asked. "Next Monday. Judge Walsh wanted to give you time to arrange for legal representation, though he did say that Miss Thompson has the right to speak for herself if she chooses." Bill nodded grimly. "What exactly is Mitchell hoping to accomplish with this?" "Even if the judge rules against me, the contract is still valid. Someone else would have to take responsibility for her debts." Sheriff Bradley looked uncomfortable. "Word is that Mitchell's prepared to assume the contract himself if the court rules that you violated its terms. He's claiming that his original bid establishes his legal interest in the matter." The implications hit Bill like a physical blow. If Mitchell succeeded in getting the contract transferred to him, Lily would be at the mercy of a man who had made no secret of his intentions. The legal protections built into the indenture system were minimal at best, and a man with Mitchell's wealth and connections could easily circumvent them if he chose. When Bill explained the situation to Lily, she received the news with the same quiet courage she had shown throughout their ordeal, but he could see the fear lurking behind her calm exterior. The hearing would take place when she was well into her 8th month of pregnancy, and the stress of the legal proceedings could potentially trigger premature labor. "We'll fight this," Bill told her firmly. "I'll hire the best lawyer I can find, and we'll make sure the judge understands exactly what kind of man Mitchell is and what his real motivations are." But even as he spoke the words, Bill knew that the legal system favored men like Mitchell, who had the resources to buy the best representation and the political connections to influence outcomes. The upcoming hearing would be more than just a legal proceeding. It would be a test of whether justice and decency could prevail against wealth and corruption in a frontier community where the rule of law was still fragile and imperfect. As the date of the hearing approached, Bill found himself facing the greatest challenge of his life since Emma's death. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure would mean not just his own disgrace, but Lily's subjection to a fate that might be worse than death. The man who had once been content to live quietly on his ranch, avoiding the complications of community politics and social conflict, now found himself at the center of a battle that would determine not just his own future, but the kind of community Cedar Falls would become. The personal cost of his decision to help Lily was becoming clear in ways he had never anticipated. He stood to lose his reputation, his livelihood, and possibly even his freedom if Mitchell's lawyers succeeded in painting him as a predator who had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. But as he looked at Lily, saw the trust in her eyes and the quiet dignity with which she faced each new challenge, Bill knew that he would pay any price necessary to protect her from the men who saw her as nothing more than property to be bought and sold. The battle lines were drawn, and there could be no retreat. In less than a week, everything he had built and everything he believed in would be put to the ultimate test in a courtroom, where the outcome would depend as much on politics and prejudice as on law and justice. The quiet life he had known since Emma's death was over, replaced by a conflict that would define not just his own character, but the moral foundation of the entire community. The courthouse in Cedar Falls had never seen such a crowd. Word of the hearing had spread throughout the territory, drawing spectators from settlements as far as 50 miles away. Some came out of genuine concern for justice. Others were drawn by the promise of scandal and sensation. The February morning was bitter cold, but the courthouse steps were packed with people stamping their feet and breathing clouds of vapor. As they waited for the doors to open, Bill arrived with Lily in his wagon, accompanied by Dr. Hayes and Agnes Porter, who had insisted on attending as character witnesses. The crowd parted reluctantly as they made their way toward the courthouse entrance, and Bill could feel the weight of dozens of stares following their progress. Some faces showed sympathy or curiosity, but others reflected the kind of righteous anger that came from people convinced they were witnessing a public reckoning with sin and corruption. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was even more charged. Robert Mitchell sat at the plaintiff's table with his expensive lawyers, two men in fine suits who had traveled from the territorial capital specifically for this case. They spoke in low, confident tones, occasionally glancing toward Bill and Lily with the satisfied expressions of hunters who were certain of bringing down their prey. Judge Walsh took his seat behind the bench with the grave dignity befitting the occasion, but Bill could see the tension in the older man's posture. This hearing would be scrutinized far beyond the borders of Cedar Falls, and the judge knew that his ruling would either enhance or damage his reputation throughout the territory. Political considerations would weigh heavily on any decision he made. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Hamilton Cross, opened with a presentation that painted Bill as a predator who had exploited legal technicalities to gain control over a vulnerable woman for his own perverted purposes. His voice carried the conviction of a man who believed his own rhetoric, and he spoke with the kind of moral certainty that impressed juries and swayed public opinion. "Your Honor," Cross declared, pacing before the bench with theatrical precision, "this case represents a mockery of our legal system and a violation of the moral principles upon which our society is founded. The defendant, William Carter, conspired to circumvent the lawful bidding process at a public auction, depriving legitimate bidders of their rights and subjecting an innocent young woman to conditions that amount to nothing less than concubinage. The word hung in the air like an accusation of witchcraft, and Bill felt Lily stiffen beside him. Cross continued his assault, detailing allegations that had no basis in fact, but sounded plausible enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of anyone predisposed to believe the worst. "The evidence will show," Cross proclaimed, "that Miss Thompson has been isolated from proper female supervision, denied access to appropriate medical care, and subjected to living arrangements that violate both the letter and spirit of territorial law governing indenture contracts. Mr. Mitchell, a respected member of this community and a man of unquestioned moral character, seeks only to ensure that justice is served and that Miss Thompson receives the protection she deserves." When it came time for Bill to present his defense, he stood without legal representation, having decided that no hired lawyer could speak with the passion and conviction that this case demanded. His voice was steady as he addressed the court, but those who knew him could hear the controlled anger beneath his calm exterior. "Your Honor, every allegation made by the prosecution is false. Miss Thompson has been treated with respect and dignity from the moment she entered my household. She has received the finest medical care available, as Dr. Hayes will testify. She has been given comfortable living quarters, adequate food and clothing, and the freedom to come and go as she pleases within the bounds of safety and propriety." Bill paused, letting his gaze sweep across the packed courtroom before continuing. "The real question before this court is not whether I have violated any contract terms, because I have not. The real question is whether we will allow wealthy and powerful men to use our legal system to persecute those who dare to show compassion for the less fortunate." The first witness called by the prosecution was Martha Collins, who testified with evident relish about the scandalous nature of the living arrangements at Broken Creek Ranch. Her testimony was long on innuendo and short on actual evidence, but she spoke with the authority of a woman who considered herself the moral guardian of the community. "It simply isn't natural," she declared from the witness stand, her voice carrying to every corner of the courthouse. "An unmarried man and a pregnant woman living alone together with no proper supervision or chaperonage. I've seen how he looks at her when they come to town, and it's not the way an employer looks at a servant, I can tell you that much." When Bill's lawyer cross-examined her, if he could be called that since he was representing himself, he exposed the gossip and speculation that formed the foundation of her testimony. "Mrs. Collins, have you ever personally witnessed any improper behavior between Miss Thompson and myself?" "Well, no, but have you ever spoken privately with Miss Thompson about her treatment at my ranch?" "I tried to, but she wouldn't." "So your testimony is based entirely on gossip and your own assumptions about what might be happening, rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing." Martha's face reddened with indignation. "Some things don't need to be witnessed to be understood, Mr. Carter. Decent people can recognize indecency when they see it." The prosecution's case continued with similar witnesses, each offering opinions and speculation, but no concrete evidence of abuse or contract violation. Pastor Rivers testified about the moral danger posed by the arrangement, while several of Mitchell's associates spoke about their concerns for Miss Thompson's welfare and their client's noble desire to rescue her from her situation. When Mitchell himself took the stand, he presented himself as a concerned citizen motivated solely by humanitarian impulses. He spoke eloquently about his desire to provide Miss Thompson with proper supervision and protection, carefully avoiding any mention of his true intentions or his reputation for mistreating the women who worked on his ranch. "I bear no ill will toward Mr. Carter," Mitchell testified with practiced sincerity. "I simply believe that a young woman in Miss Thompson's condition deserves better than to be hidden away on an isolated ranch with no female companionship or guidance. I have a large household staff that includes several respectable women who could provide the kind of supervision and support that she needs during this difficult time. But when Bill began presenting his defense, the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. Dr. Hayes took the stand first, her professional credentials and reputation for integrity lending weight to every word she spoke. I have examined Miss Thompson regularly since she came to live at Mr. Carter's ranch, the doctor testified firmly. She has received excellent care, proper nutrition, and appropriate medical attention. Her living quarters are clean, comfortable, and entirely suitable for a woman in her condition. I have observed no signs of physical abuse, coercion, or mistreatment of any kind. Dr. Hayes paused, her keen eyes scanning the courtroom before she continued. Furthermore, I have had extensive conversations with Miss Thompson about her situation, and she has consistently expressed gratitude for Mr. Carter's kindness and protection. Any suggestion that she is being held against her will or subjected to improper conditions is simply false. Agnes Porter followed with testimony about her weekly visits to the ranch and her observations of the relationship between Bill and Lily. The schoolteacher spoke with quiet conviction about the respect and consideration she had witnessed, painting a picture that directly contradicted the prosecution's allegations. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Miguel Santana took the stand and spoke in his accented but clear English about what he had observed during his years of working for Bill Carter. "Senator Carter, he is a good man," Miguel said simply. "When his wife was sick, he cared for her like she was made of glass. Now he cared for Miss Thompson the same way, with respect and kindness. I worked for many men in my life, some good, some bad. Senator Carter, he's one of the good ones." Miguel's testimony carried special weight because everyone in the courtroom knew that ranch hands were often the most reliable witnesses to their employer's true character. His loyalty to Bill was evident, but so was his honesty and integrity. Joseph followed with similar testimony, and then Dr. Hayes was recalled to present evidence that would transform the entire proceedings. The doctor approached the bench with a folder of documents, her expression grave as she prepared to reveal information that would shock everyone present. "Your Honor, I have here the medical records for several women who have worked on Mr. Mitchell's ranch over the past 5 years. With the court's permission, I would like to present evidence regarding the treatment these women received under his supervision." Hamilton Cross jumped to his feet with an objection. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Mitchell is not on trial here, and his past employment practices are not relevant to the current case." Judge Walsh considered the objection carefully. "Dr. Hayes, what is the relevance of this evidence to the matter before the court?" "Your Honor, the prosecution has argued that Mr. Mitchell would provide better care and supervision for Miss Thompson than she currently receives. I believe the court has a right to know about his track record in caring for vulnerable women." After a heated debate between the lawyers, Judge Walsh ruled that the evidence would be admitted. What Dr. Hayes revealed sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom that quickly escalated into outraged murmuring. The records show that 3 women who worked for Mr. Mitchell suffered serious injuries that were consistent with physical abuse. Dr. Hayes testified, her voice carrying clearly over the noise from the gallery. "One woman, Maria Santos, was brought to me with a broken arm and facial bruises. She claimed to have fallen from a horse, but the pattern of injuries was inconsistent with that explanation." The doctor continued methodically, detailing case after case of suspicious injuries and unexplained deaths among the women who had worked on Mitchell's ranch. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic abuse and exploitation, hidden behind a facade of respectability and protected by Mitchell's wealth and influence. "Furthermore," Dr. Hayes added, her voice growing stronger as she sensed the shift in the courtroom's mood, "I have reason to believe that at least 2 women who worked for Mr. Mitchell died under suspicious circumstances, though their deaths were ruled accidental by the previous coroner. who was known to be financially indebted to Mr. Mitchell. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Mitchell's face had gone pale, and his lawyers were frantically conferring in whispered conversations. The carefully constructed image of the humanitarian rescuer was crumbling before everyone's eyes, replaced by the portrait of a predator who used his wealth and position to victimize the powerless. But Dr. Hayes wasn't finished. She turned to face the gallery, her voice carrying the authority of her profession and her commitment to the truth. I want this court and this community to understand something. The system that allows women to be bought and sold like livestock is inherently corrupt, regardless of who participates in it. But when men like Mr. Mitchell exploit that system for their own perverted purposes, it becomes not just corrupt but evil. The doctor's words hung in the air like a condemnation not just of Mitchell, but of the entire social structure that had created the situation. Judge Walsh called for order as the gallery erupted in angry voices and shocked exclamations. When Lily finally took the stand to speak for herself, the courthouse fell silent. Her pregnancy was now unmistakable, and she moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo. But her voice was strong and clear as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I want to speak for myself about my treatment at Mr. Carter's ranch," she began, her hands folded carefully over her belly. "I have been treated with kindness, respect, and dignity from the first day I arrived. Mr. Carter has asked nothing of me except that I accept his help and protection. He has provided me with comfortable quarters, excellent medical care, and the freedom to make my own choices about my future." Lily paused, gathering strength for what she knew would be the most important words she had ever spoken. "I know what people have been saying about our arrangement, and I understand why some might find it unusual. But I also know that Mr. Carter saved me from a fate that would have been far worse than anything I could have imagined. When I stood on that auction platform, I was facing the prospect of being sold to a man who saw me as nothing more than property, to be used and discarded." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Mr. Carter didn't just buy my contract, Your Honor. He gave me back my dignity, my hope, and my faith that there are still good people in this world who will stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves." The emotional impact of her testimony was evident in the faces throughout the courtroom. Even some of Mitchell's supporters seemed moved by her quiet eloquence and obvious sincerity. When the prosecution attempted to cross-examine her, suggesting that she might be afraid to tell the truth about her treatment, Lily's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Sir, I have nothing to fear from telling the truth. If Mr. Carter had mistreated me in any way, do you think Dr. Hayes would have remained silent about it? Do you think Agnes Porter would continue to visit me? Do you think I would defend a man who had hurt me?" The cross-examination crumbled under the weight of her logic and obvious honesty. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when an unexpected witness arrived just as Judge Walsh was preparing to recess for deliberation. Sheriff Bradley entered the courtroom with a woman Bill didn't recognize, a middle-aged Mexican woman who looked terrified but determined. "Your Honor," the sheriff announced, "this is Carmen Rodriguez. She has information relevant to this case that has just come to my attention." Carmen took the stand with visible reluctance, her heavily accented English barely audible as she began to speak. But as her story unfolded, the courtroom grew deathly quiet. "I worked for Senator Mitchell for 2 years, she testified, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "My daughter, she worked there too. Elena, she was 17 when she started. She was good girl, work hard, send money home to her family." Carmen's hands trembled as she continued. "Senator Mitchell, he say Elena was pretty girl, that she could earn extra money if she was nice to him. When she say no, he get angry. He say she owe him money for food and shelter, that she cannot leave until she pay." The woman's testimony detailed a pattern of abuse and coercion that made Mitchell's earlier claims of humanitarian concern sound obscene. She described how her daughter had been beaten for refusing Mitchell's advances, how she had been locked in a root cellar for days without food as punishment for trying to escape. "Elena, she get pregnant," Carmen continued, tears streaming down her face. "Senator Mitchell, he say it was not his baby, that she was whore who sleep with ranch hands, but she was good girl. She never. The woman broke down, unable to continue for several minutes. When she finally composed herself enough to speak, her final words sent a chill through everyone present. "Elena die in childbirth. Senator Mitchell, he say she die because she was weak, that God was punishing her for her sins. But I know truth. She die because he no let doctor come. He say doctor cost too much money for worthless girl." The impact of Carmen's testimony was immediate and devastating. Mitchell's face had gone ashen, and his lawyers were conferring frantically. Several people in the gallery were openly weeping, and Judge Walsh had to call for order multiple times. When Hamilton Cross attempted to discredit Carmen's testimony, suggesting that she was lying or had been coached, her response was simple and powerful. "Why I lie about my dead daughter? What I gain from this pain? I tell truth because maybe I save other girl from same fate." The prosecution's case collapsed completely. Mitchell's lawyers requested a recess to confer with their client, and when court reconvened, they announced that they were withdrawing their petition to assume Lily's contract. Judge Walsh's ruling was brief and decisive. After hearing all the evidence presented, this court finds no merit in the allegations against Mr. Carter. The indenture contract between Mr. Carter and Miss Thompson will remain in effect as originally agreed, subject to the standard protections afforded under territorial law. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Mitchell, who sat slumped in his chair like a man watching his world collapse around him. Furthermore, this court is ordering a formal investigation into the allegations of abuse and wrongful death on the Mitchell Ranch. Sheriff Bradley, you are directed to coordinate with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office to determine whether criminal charges are warranted. The courthouse erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Mitchell's supporters were stunned by the reversal of fortune, while those who had defended Bill and Lily felt vindicated by the exposure of the truth. As people began filing out of the courthouse, Bill helped Lily down from the witness stand, his face reflecting a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The ordeal was over, but both of them knew that their lives had been permanently changed by the experience. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to congratulate Bill and offer support to Lily. Dr. Hayes announced that she would be opening a clinic specifically to serve women in vulnerable situations, funded by donations from people who had been moved by the day's revelations. Agnes Porter spoke about starting a literacy program for ranch workers and their families. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitude of the community itself. The trial had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they had created and the systems they had allowed to flourish. The exposure of Mitchell's crimes had shattered illusions about wealth and respectability, while Bill and Lily's story had demonstrated the power of individual courage and compassion. 3 months later, on a warm spring morning, Lily gave birth to a healthy daughter with Dr. Hayes attending and Bill pacing nervously in the kitchen below. When the doctor finally emerged with the news that both mother and baby were doing well, Bill felt a joy he hadn't experienced since the early days of his marriage to Emma. Lily named the baby Emma Grace, honoring both Bill's late wife and the grace that had brought them together. The child would grow up on Broken Creek Ranch, surrounded by love and protected by a man who had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost. Robert Mitchell was eventually convicted of multiple charges including assault, wrongful imprisonment, and negligent homicide in the death of Elena Rodriguez. He was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, and his ranch was sold to pay restitution to his victims and their families. The indenture contract between Bill and Lily was quietly dissolved 6 months early, though she chose to remain at the ranch as his partner in both business and life. They were married in a small ceremony attended by Miguel, Joseph, Dr. Hayes, Agnes Porter, and a handful of friends who had stood by them during their darkest days. Years later, when people told the story of the lonely rancher who bought a pregnant girl at auction for $1, they always emphasized the transformation that followed. Broken Creek Ranch became a sanctuary for women escaping abusive situations. Funded by profits from Bill's expanding cattle operation and donations from supporters throughout the territory, Lily established a school on the ranch property, teaching literacy and practical skills to anyone who wanted to learn. Emma Grace grew up bilingual, learning Spanish from Miguel and helping her mother with students who came from far and wide to take advantage of the educational opportunities. Dr. Hayes's clinic became a model for women's healthcare throughout the territory, and Agnes Porter's literacy programs were adopted by communities across Montana. The trial that had begun as an attempt to destroy two people's lives had instead sparked a movement for social reform that would influence the territory for generations. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the simple lesson that courage and compassion could triumph over wealth and corruption when ordinary people decided to stand up for what was right. The $1 bid that had seemed like such a small gesture had grown into something much larger, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness can change the world when they come from a heart committed to justice. As Bill and Lily watched their daughter take her first steps across the porch where Emma had once sat with her morning coffee, they knew that the pain and struggle of those early days had been worth enduring. They had built something together that would outlast their own lives, a legacy of hope and healing that would touch countless lives in the years to come. The wind still whispered through the Montana hills, but now it carried different stories. Tales of redemption and second chances rather than isolation and despair. And somewhere in that wind, those who listened carefully could hear the echo of an auction gavel falling and a quiet voice saying, $1. Words that had changed everything. For the better. Dawn broke over Cedar Falls with an ominous red glow that old-timers said meant trouble was coming. The courthouse bells had been ringing since 4 in the morning, summoning every soul within 50 miles to witness what would either be a triumph of justice or the complete destruction of everything Bill Carter had tried to build. By the time the sun cleared the eastern mountains, the streets around the courthouse were packed with wagons, horses, and people who had traveled through the February cold to see how the most scandalous legal case in territorial history would unfold. Judge Henry Walsh had arrived at his chambers before sunrise, knowing that this day would define not just the lives of those directly involved, but the moral character of the entire community he had served for over 2 decades. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden as he reviewed the legal documents one final time, knowing that his decisions would be scrutinized by lawyers and politicians far beyond the borders of Montana territory. Bill Carter stood on the courthouse steps with Lily beside him, both of them surrounded by a small group of supporters who had grown into something resembling a movement over the past weeks. Dr. Margaret Hayes carried herself with the stern dignity of a woman who had seen too much suffering to remain silent when truth needed to be spoken. Agnes Porter clutched a folder of testimonial letters from former students and their families, evidence of character that she hoped might counterbalance the accusations that had been leveled against her friend. Miguel Santana and Joseph Williams flanked the group like protective sentinels, their weathered faces reflecting years of loyalty to a man they considered more brother than employer. Both ranch hands had insisted on testifying, despite knowing that their words might carry less weight than those of more prominent citizens. Their presence spoke to something deeper than legal obligation. It represented the kind of respect that could only be earned through consistent decency over many years. The crowd that had gathered represented every social stratum of frontier society, From wealthy ranchers in expensive suits to struggling farmers wearing their only clean clothes. Some faces showed genuine concern for justice, while others reflected the hungry anticipation of spectators drawn to witness either vindication or destruction. The air crackled with tension that seemed to make every conversation feel like a potential confrontation. Robert Mitchell arrived in a polished carriage drawn by matched horses, accompanied by an entourage that included not just his high-priced lawyers, but several influential men, whose presence was clearly intended to demonstrate the political weight behind his cause. Hamilton Cross, the territorial prosecutor he had hired, carried himself with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed that superior resources always trumped superior arguments in legal proceedings. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls in spaces that normally would have been considered dangerously overcrowded. Judge Walsh had reluctantly agreed to allow reporters from territorial newspapers to attend, knowing that the story would spread far beyond Cedar Falls, regardless of his preferences. The atmosphere was charged with an electricity that made conversations difficult and silence impossible to maintain. When court was called to session, Judge Walsh's opening remarks carried a weight of solemnity that immediately commanded attention from even the most restless spectators. His voice carried clearly to every corner of the packed room as he outlined the gravity of the proceedings and the standards of evidence that would govern his decision. This court will determine whether the indenture contract between Mr. William Carter and Miss Lily Thompson has been violated, and whether grounds exist for transferring that contract to another party, Judge Walsh announced. We will conduct these proceedings according to territorial law and the principles of justice, without regard for public opinion or political pressure. Hamilton Cross rose to present the prosecution's case with theatrical flourishes that would have impressed audiences in territorial capitals, but seemed somewhat overwrought in the frontier courthouse. His opening statement painted Bill as a calculating predator who had exploited legal technicalities to gain control over a vulnerable woman for purposes that violated both law and decency. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mr. Carter has systematically isolated Miss Thompson from proper supervision, denied her access to appropriate spiritual guidance, and subjected her to living conditions that amount to exploitation under the guise of legal employment, Cross declared, his voice carrying throughout the courthouse with practiced authority. The prosecutor's presentation was carefully crafted to appeal to the prejudices and assumptions of his audience, suggesting impropriety without making specific accusations that could be directly refuted. He spoke about unnatural intimacy and violation of community standards in terms that left plenty of room for imagination, while stopping just short of actionable defamation. When Bill rose to present his own defense, declining Judge Walsh's offer to postpone until he could secure legal representation, his words carried a different kind of authority, the quiet conviction of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. His voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of controlled anger that those who knew him recognized as potentially dangerous. Your Honor, every allegation made by the prosecution is not merely false, but deliberately malicious. Bill stated clearly. Miss Thompson has been treated with complete respect and consideration from the moment she entered my household. She has received excellent medical care, comfortable living arrangements, proper nutrition, and absolute freedom to communicate with anyone she chooses. Bill's defense was built on facts rather than rhetoric, presenting a systematic refutation of each accusation while challenging the underlying assumptions that made such charges seem plausible to some members of the community. His calm presentation stood in stark contrast to the prosecution's theatrical approach, creating an impression of honest directness versus calculated manipulation. The prosecution began its case by calling a succession of witnesses whose testimony revealed more about their own prejudices than about the actual circumstances at Broken Creek Ranch. Martha Collins testified with obvious relish about the scandalous nature of the living arrangements, though her cross-examination revealed that her opinions were based entirely on gossip and speculation rather than direct observation. Pastor Samuel Rivers spoke at length about the spiritual dangers posed by the arrangement, painting vivid pictures of moral corruption that threatened the foundations of Christian society. His testimony was passionate and sincere, but it became clear that his concerns were more theological than practical, based on abstract principles rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. Several of Mitchell's business associates testified about their concerns for Miss Thompson's welfare, carefully avoiding any mention of their client's reputation among his own workers or the rumors that had circulated for years about his treatment of vulnerable employees. Their testimony was polished and coordinated, suggesting careful preparation and coaching. When Mitchell himself took the witness stand, he presented a masterful performance of concerned citizenship and humanitarian compassion. His testimony was carefully crafted to appeal to every prejudice and assumption that might work in his favor, while avoiding any statements that could be directly contradicted by evidence. "I bear no personal animosity toward Mr. Carter," Mitchell testified with practiced sincerity. "However, I cannot stand by and watch while a young woman in Miss Thompson's condition is subjected to living arrangements that violate both legal precedent and moral principle. I have resources and facilities that could provide her with proper supervision and support during this difficult time." Mitchell's presentation was so polished and reasonable that even some of Bill's supporters began to wonder whether their faith in his character might have been misplaced. The wealthy rancher spoke eloquently about his desire to provide appropriate female supervision, proper medical care, and structured environments that would help Miss Thompson prepare for motherhood and eventual reintegration into respectable society. But when Bill began presenting his defense, the atmosphere in the courtroom underwent a dramatic transformation. Dr. Margaret Hayes took the witness stand with the quiet authority that came from 30 years of medical practice and a reputation for absolute integrity that even Mitchell's supporters could incredibly challenge. "I have been providing medical care for Miss Thompson since shortly after her arrival at Mr. Carter's ranch," Dr. Hayes testified with professional precision. "During that time, I have conducted regular examinations and have observed consistent improvement in her physical health, emotional well-being, and overall condition." The doctor's testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case, but she expanded her remarks beyond simple medical observations to address the broader questions of character and motivation that lay beneath the surface of the legal proceedings. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I want to address directly the allegations about Miss Thompson's living conditions and the supposed lack of proper supervision. I have visited the Carter Ranch on numerous occasions, both for medical consultations and social visits. Miss Thompson's quarters are not only appropriate, but superior to anything most women in her circumstances could expect to receive." Dr. Hayes paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering what would prove to be the most damaging blow to the prosecution's case. "I have also had extensive opportunities to observe the interaction between Mr. Carter and Miss Thompson, and I can state categorically that their relationship is characterized by mutual respect, appropriate boundaries, and genuine concern for her welfare and that of her unborn child." Agnes Porter followed with testimony that provided a different perspective on the relationship between Bill and Lily, speaking with the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to protecting and nurturing young people in difficult circumstances. Her weekly visits to the ranch had given her insights that no casual observer could possess. "I have observed Miss Thompson carefully during my visits, looking specifically for any signs of fear, coercion, or distress that might indicate mistreatment," Agnes testified with quiet conviction. "What I have seen instead is a young woman who feels safe, protected, and respected. Her demeanor is that of someone who has found sanctuary, not someone living under threat." The schoolteacher's testimony carried special weight because of her professional experience with vulnerable young people and her reputation for speaking truth, regardless of its popularity. when the prosecution attempted to suggest that her friendship with Miss Thompson might compromise her objectivity, Ann's response was both sharp and definitive. "Mr. Cross, I have been evaluating the welfare of young people for most of my adult life. I know the difference between genuine protection and subtle coercion, between authentic care and calculated manipulation. What I have witnessed at the Carter Ranch represents the highest standards of decency and compassion." Miguel Santana's testimony provided a perspective that surprised everyone in the courtroom with its eloquence and moral authority. The ranch foreman spoke in accented but perfectly clear English, drawing on 15 years of close observation to paint a picture of Bill's character that contradicted every allegation the prosecution had made. "Senator Carter, he's a man who shows his true nature when he thinks no one is watching," Miguel testified with simple dignity. "I have seen him care for sick animals with the same gentleness he shows to people. I have watched him give his own coat to a shivering child, and then claim he was too warm anyway. This is not a man who would harm any woman, much less one who came to him seeking protection." The foreman's testimony carried special impact because his loyalty was clearly based on genuine respect rather than financial dependence. His obvious devotion to Bill spoke volumes about the kind of employer and man the defendant really was, providing insights that no amount of legal maneuvering could duplicate or discredit. Joseph's testimony echoed Miguel's observations while adding details about Bill's behavior during Emma's final illness that revealed depths of character that even his closest friends hadn't fully appreciated. The picture that emerged was of a man whose kindness and consideration weren't limited to public displays, but extended to every aspect of his daily life. But it was Dr. Hayes's return to the witness stand that transformed the trial from a simple contract dispute into something approaching a criminal investigation. The doctor approached the bench carrying medical records that would forever change how the community viewed Robert Mitchell and the system that had allowed his behavior to continue unchallenged. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I wish to present evidence that bears directly on Mr. Mitchell's fitness to assume responsibility for Miss Thompson's welfare," Dr. Hayes announced, her voice carrying an ominous note that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward in anticipation. Hamilton Cross's objection was immediate and frantic. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the matter before the court. Mr. Mitchell is not on trial here, and his past employment practices have no bearing on the current case." Judge Walsh considered the objection carefully, clearly aware that his ruling could determine the entire course of the trial. After a brief but heated debate between the attorneys, he ruled that the evidence would be admitted as relevant to the question of alternative placement, should the court find Miss Thompson's current situation unsatisfactory. What Dr. Hayes revealed sent shockwaves through the courtroom that quickly escalated into barely controlled outrage. Her medical records documented a pattern of abuse and exploitation that had been hidden behind Mitchell's facade of respectability. For years, protected by his wealth and political connections. The records I am presenting document the medical treatment I provided to 19 different women who worked on Mr. Mitchell's ranch over the past decade, Dr. Hayes testified, her voice growing stronger as she sensed the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. These women suffered injuries and illnesses that formed a clear pattern of systematic abuse, medical neglect, and deliberate exploitation. The doctor began reading from her meticulously documented records, detailing case after case of suspicious injuries, mysterious illnesses, and preventable deaths. Maria Gonzalez, age 18, treated for severe malnutrition and infected wounds on her wrists, consistent with prolonged restraint. She claimed to have injured herself in a fall, but the medical evidence was incompatible with such an explanation. As Dr. Hayes continued through her records, the courtroom grew increasingly silent, with people straining to hear every horrifying detail of systematic abuse that had been allowed to continue for years. Rosa Martinez, age 20, brought to my clinic suffering from internal injuries and psychological trauma after allegedly being attacked by wild animals. However, the pattern of injuries was consistent with deliberate assault rather than animal attack. The pattern that emerged was one of calculated cruelty, hidden behind legal technicalities and protected by Mitchell's reputation as a pillar of the community. Each case represented not just individual tragedy, but collective failure of a society that had been willing to look the other way as long as the victims were powerless and the perpetrator was wealthy. Elena Rodriguez, age 17, died of complications from childbirth when Mr. Mitchell refused to allow me to attend her delivery, claiming that she had brought her condition upon herself through immoral behavior and that medical intervention would violate God's will. Dr. Hayes continued, her voice breaking slightly as she recalled the preventable tragedy. The revelation of deliberately caused deaths sent a chill through the courtroom that was almost palpable. Several women in the gallery began weeping openly, while the men sat in stunned silence as they contemplated the implications of what they were hearing. But Dr. Hayes wasn't finished with her devastating testimony. She set aside her medical records and faced the gallery directly, her voice carrying the full weight of her professional authority and moral conviction. I want this court and this community to understand something that we have all been too comfortable ignoring, she declared with passionate intensity. The system that allows human beings to be bought and sold like livestock is inherently corrupting, regardless of how it might be legally justified or socially rationalized. The doctor's condemnation expanded beyond Mitchell to encompass the entire social structure that had created and perpetuated the conditions they were grappling with. But when men like Robert Mitchell exploit that system for their own perverted purposes, turning legal contracts into instruments of torture and murder, we become accomplices to evil through our silence and inaction. Judge Walsh called for order as the gallery erupted in angry voices and emotional outbursts. But the damage to Mitchell's reputation and credibility was complete and irreversible. The carefully constructed image of the humanitarian rescuer had been shattered beyond repair, replaced by the portrait of a predator whose crimes had been enabled by community indifference and legal loopholes. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when an unexpected witness arrived just as the defense was preparing to rest its case. Carmen Rodriguez entered the courtroom supported by her adult son, her weathered face showing the kind of grief that could never be fully healed, but only endured with quiet dignity. Your Honor, Sheriff Bradley announced, this is Carmen Rodriguez, mother of Elena Rodriguez, whose death was mentioned in Dr. Hayes' testimony. She has traveled over 300 miles to provide testimony that I believe this court needs to hear. Carmen took the witness stand with obvious reluctance, her heavily accented English barely audible as she began to speak. But as her story unfolded, the courtroom grew so quiet that the sound of people breathing seemed unnaturally loud. My daughter Elena, she was a good girl who go to work for Senator Mitchell to help Familia pay for medicine for her sick abuela. Carmen testified, her voice growing stronger as she drew on reserves of courage that only a mother's love could provide. She was 17, beautiful, smart, wanted to learn to read English so she could maybe teach children someday. Carmen's testimony detailed the systematic destruction of her daughter's hopes and dreams through escalating abuse and exploitation that had been carefully hidden from the outside world. Senator Mitchell, he say Elena was very pretty, that she could earn extra money if she was nice to him. When she say no, that she was saving herself for marriage like good Catholic girl, he get angry and start making her life very hard. The pattern of abuse that Carmen described was methodical and calculating, designed to break down resistance through hunger, isolation, and carefully applied violence. Elena, she tried to send letters home, but somehow they never come. She tried to run away, but he always catch her and then punish her worse. He say she owe him money for everything, that she never leave until she pay back what he say she owe. Carmen's voice broke as she reached the most painful part of her testimony. But she forced herself to continue because she knew that her daughter's death would be meaningless unless it prevented similar tragedies. Elena, she get pregnant and Senator Mitchell say it was not his baby, that she was bad girl who sleep with ranch hands. But I know my daughter. She was pure girl who never even hold hands with boy before she go to his ranch. The final part of Carmen's testimony revealed the depths of Mitchell's callousness and disregard for human life. When Elena's time come to have baby, she was very sick, very scared. She begged for doctor, but Senator Mitchell say doctor cost too much money for worthless girl who brings shame on herself. He say if God want her to live, she live without help from doctors. Carmen broke down completely as she described her daughter's agonizing death, but she forced herself to finish her testimony because she knew that justice for Elena required the complete truth to be told. Elena died after 3 days of terrible pain, calling for her mama who could not come to help her. Baby died too, little boy who never get chance to take even one breath. The impact of Carmen's testimony was immediate and devastating. Mitchell's face had gone ashen, and his attorneys were conferring frantically as they realized that their client's carefully constructed defense had collapsed completely. Several people in the gallery were sobbing openly, while others muttered angrily about the injustices that had been allowed to continue unchallenged. When Hamilton Cross rose to cross-examine Carmen, his questions were designed to discredit her testimony by suggesting that grief had distorted her memories or that she had been coached by Bill's supporters. Her response was simple but devastating in its emotional power. "You ask why I tell these things that hurt so much to remember," Carmen said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the silent courtroom. "I tell because maybe, if people know truth about what this man do to my Elena, maybe some other mama not have to lose her baby the same way." Cross's attempts to undermine her credibility only made him appear callous and desperate, while Carmen's obvious grief and sincerity resonated with everyone present. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, Mitchell's case had been completely destroyed. When Lily finally took the witness stand to speak for herself, the courthouse atmosphere had been transformed by the revelations about Mitchell's true character. Her testimony took on new significance as the courtroom realized that they were witnessing not just a contract dispute but a battle between good and evil that could determine her very survival. "Your Honor, I have listened to all the testimony presented here today, and I feel compelled to speak about my treatment at Mr. Carter's ranch," Lily began, her voice stronger and clearer than anyone had expected. "I have been treated with kindness, respect, and dignity from the very first moment I arrived. Mr. Carter has never asked anything of me except that I accept his protection when I needed it most desperately." Lily's testimony gained power as she continued, drawing on inner strength that had carried her through months of uncertainty and social condemnation. "I know there has been speculation about the nature of our relationship, and I understand why some people might find our arrangement unusual. But I also know that Mr. Carter saved me from a fate that would have been worse than anything most people can imagine." She paused, gathering courage for what she knew would be the most important words she had ever spoken. "When I stood on that auction platform last November, I could see exactly what kind of treatment awaited me if I became Mr. Mitchell's property. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about his intentions, and Dr. Hayes's testimony has confirmed my worst fears about what my life would have become." The emotional impact of her testimony was evident throughout the courtroom, as people contemplated how close they had come to witnessing another tragedy like the one that had claimed Elena Rodriguez's life. "Mr. Carter didn't just bid on my contract. That day he saved my life and that of my unborn child. He gave me back my dignity, my hope, and my faith that good people still exist in this world." When the prosecution attempted to cross-examine Lily, their questions seemed petty and irrelevant in light of what had been revealed about Mitchell's character. Her responses were confident and direct, reflecting the security of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to be grateful for. Judge Walsh's ruling was delivered with the kind of moral authority that reminded everyone present why they had entrusted him with the responsibility of dispensing justice in their community. His voice carried clearly throughout the packed courtroom as he addressed not just the immediate legal questions, but the broader moral issues that the trial had raised. After hearing all the evidence presented in this case, this court finds no merit whatsoever in the allegations against Mr. Carter. Judge Walsh announced with finality, "The indenture contract between Mr. Carter and Miss Thompson has been fulfilled in complete accordance with both territorial law and the highest standards of human decency." But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Mitchell, his voice carrying the weight of moral condemnation that would follow the man for whatever remained of his life. Furthermore, this court is profoundly disturbed by the evidence of systematic abuse and criminal behavior that has been presented regarding Mr. Mitchell's treatment of workers on his ranch. Judge Walsh's final words carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate case. "Sheriff Bradley, you are hereby directed to coordinate with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office to conduct a comprehensive investigation into these matters and to file appropriate charges against Mr. Mitchell and any accomplices who may have aided in these crimes." The courthouse erupted in a mixture of cheers, angry shouts, and emotional outbursts as people absorbed the implications of the ruling. Mitchell's supporters were stunned by the complete reversal of their expectations, while those who had defended Bill and Lily felt vindicated by the exposure of truth and the triumph of justice. As people began filing out of the courthouse, Bill helped Lily down from the witness stand, his face reflecting a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and anger at everything they had been forced to endure. The legal ordeal was over, but both of them understood that their lives had been permanently changed by the experience of having their most private affairs subjected to public scrutiny and judgment. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered to congratulate Bill and offer support to Lily, but the celebration was tempered by the sobering realization of how much suffering had been hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly respectable community. Dr. Hayes announced plans to establish a clinic dedicated specifically to serving women in vulnerable situations, while Agnes Porter spoke about expanding educational opportunities throughout the territory. The trial had accomplished far more than resolving a simple contract dispute. It had forced an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they had created and the systems they had allowed to flourish unchallenged. The exposure of Mitchell's crimes had shattered illusions about the relationship between wealth and virtue, while Bill and Lily's story had demonstrated the transformative power of individual courage and compassion. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of the trial continued to spread throughout the Montana Territory and beyond. Robert Mitchell was eventually convicted on multiple charges including assault, false imprisonment, and murder in the death of Elena Rodriguez. He was sentenced to life in territorial prison, where he died within 2 years under circumstances that were officially ruled natural but privately considered poetic justice. 4 months after the trial, on a morning that seemed to embody hope and renewal, Lily gave birth to a healthy daughter with Dr. Hayes attending and Bill waiting anxiously nearby. When the doctor emerged with news that both mother and baby were thriving, Bill experienced a joy and sense of completion that he hadn't felt since the early days of his marriage to Emma. Lily named the baby Grace Elena, honoring both the divine grace that had brought them together and the memory of Elena Rodriguez, whose tragic death had helped expose the evil that threatened other vulnerable women. The child would grow up on Broken Creek Ranch, surrounded by love and protected by people who understood the precious nature of life and the importance of defending those who couldn't defend themselves. The indenture contract between Bill and Lily was formally dissolved 9 months early, though she chose to remain at the ranch as his partner in both business and life. They were married the following spring in a ceremony that celebrated not just their love for each other, but the triumph of decency over corruption and hope over despair. Years later, when people told the story of the lonely rancher who paid $1 to save a pregnant woman from a terrible fate, they always emphasized the transformation that followed. Broken Creek Ranch became a beacon of hope for women throughout the territory, providing shelter, education, and support for anyone seeking to escape abusive situations. Lily established educational programs that became models for communities across the frontier, while Dr. Hayes's clinic grew into a network of medical facilities dedicated to serving the most vulnerable members of society. Agnes Porter's advocacy work helped establish legal protections for workers that influenced legislation throughout the Western territories. Grace Elena grew up bilingual and bicultural, learning from Miguel about the dignity of honest work and from her parents about the importance of standing up for justice regardless of personal cost. She would eventually become a teacher herself, carrying forward the legacy of education and empowerment that had grown from her mother's determination to create something positive from their shared ordeal. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of that cold February day in the Cedar Falls courthouse was the simple lesson that ordinary people possessed the power to change unjust systems when they found the courage to act according to their principles. The trial had demonstrated that truth and moral conviction could triumph over wealth and political influence, inspiring similar stands for justice throughout the developing West, as Bill and Lily grew old together on the ranch that had become synonymous with hope and redemption. They often reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought them together through so much darkness and uncertainty. The $1 bid that had seemed like such a small gesture had grown into something much larger and more significant, proving that individual acts of courage and compassion could change the world when they came from hearts committed to justice and mercy. The wind still whispered through the Montana hills around Cedar Falls, but now it carried different stories, tales of redemption and second chances rather than exploitation and despair. And somewhere in that wind, those who listened carefully could hear the echo of Carmen Rodriguez's voice speaking for her lost daughter, ensuring that Elena's death had not been in vain, but had helped save countless other lives from similar fates. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.